In the winter of 1942, as the 8th Air Force settled into its cold, fog-choked bases across England, the promise of the B-17 Flying Fortress, America's proud symbol of daylight precision bombing, was already cracking under the brutal reality of the European air war. Crews at Bassingbourn, Kimballton, Thorpe Abbotts, and Grafton Underwood woke each morning to the same chorus of Merlin engines from RAF Spitfires, escorting their own bombers home before sunrise. A reminder that the British refused to fly deep raids in daylight after suffering catastrophic losses in 1940. Yet the Americans insisted daylight bombing could work. They believed in Norden bomb sites. They believed in four-engined fortresses. They believed in tight discipline. And, above everything else, they believed the B-17 could defend itself. At least they believed that until the Luftwaffe proved them wrong. From November 1942 through early 1943, every deep raid into France and the Low Countries ended the same way. Bf-109s and FW-190s carving into bomber formations like wolves slicing through cattle. German fighters attacked head-on or from the high 12 o'clock position, exploiting the weakest arc of the B-17's defensive layout. Entire squadrons came home shredded, engines pouring oil, waist gunners carried out on stretchers with frozen limbs or shrapnel wounds. The claim that the Flying Fortress was self-defending was turning into a painful joke among ground crews who chipped bullet fragments out of aluminum skins every night. Losses remained manageable, barely, but projections for future deep raids into Germany were grim. Without long-range escort fighters, the B-17 was flying into a sky ruled entirely by the Jagdgeschwader. Something had to change. In January 1943, Brigadier General Frank Armstrong, commanding the 306th Bomb Group, gathered his squadron leaders in a frigid Quonset hut and laid out the hard truth. We are not surviving because we are not concentrating our guns. The Luftwaffe is beating us in detail. That ends now. He sketched a new idea on a chalkboard. Nothing fancy, nothing revolutionary, but something no bomber force had yet executed properly. A layered, three-dimensional formation, where each B-17 overlapped its guns with the aircraft above, below, and alongside it. A formation that turned a group of 21 bombers into a single flying fortress. In the weeks that followed, Armstrong's idea blended with parallel concepts already being explored by Colonel Curtis LeMay of the 305th Bomb Group. LeMay had studied Luftwaffe attack patterns intensely, noting the angles where fighters avoided .5 cal fire and identifying the arcs where firepower needed to be densest. He realized that proper geometry, not just tight flying, was the key. A bomber low on the left should guard the belly of a bomber high on the right. The top turret of one aircraft should protect the next formation element's nose. Waist gunners should overlap firing arcs like interlocking teeth. It was elegant, deadly, and incredibly difficult to execute. The first experimental flights were disastrous. Pilots accustomed to loose trail formations struggled to maintain LeMay's precise spacing, 15 to 30 meters vertically, no more than 20 to 25 meters horizontally. In the icy February air over the Wash, two B-17s clipped wingtips while climbing into position, forcing one to abort. Another burst a tire landing after a turbulent formation break. Chief crews joked that LeMay was trying to kill them before the Germans could. But slowly, painfully, the squadrons began to adapt. At Thorpe Abbotts, the 100th Bomb Group, soon to earn the nickname the Bloody 100th, spent entire days practicing formation takeoffs, tightening their spacing until the sky above East Anglia filled with stacked layers of silver aircraft. Gunners drilled simultaneously, calling out imaginary enemy bearings while their pilots held formation through turbulence and cloud. The goal was simple: build a formation so tight that Luftwaffe pilots would break off their attacks before reaching effective firing range. And then came the moment of clarity. On 5th March 1943, during a raid on the marshalling yards at Hamm, a provisional version of the formation, still crude compared to what it would later become, produced something astonishing. When a swarm of FW-190s dove in from high 1 o'clock, they expected to rake the lead squadron with cannon fire. Instead, they flew straight into a wall of overlapping .5 caliber fire from three stacked elements. Two FW-190s fell in flames, a third peeled away trailing smoke. Luftwaffe communications intercepted later that day recorded the startled reaction. The Americans have changed their formation. Many guns, much stronger fire. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't refined, but it worked. Enough to matter, enough to survive. By mid-March 1943, LeMay and Armstrong formalized the structure and gave it a name that would reshape the air war: the Combat Box, a three-tiered fortress in the sky, a machine made not of aluminum and steel, but of discipline, a formation so tight it turned 24 aircraft into a single weapon. And as the 8th Air Force prepared for deeper raids that spring, into the Ruhr, into Schweinfurt, into the heart of Hitler's industrial empire, the Germans had no idea that the era of easy victories over B-17 formations was coming to a violent end. By the spring of 1943, the 8th Air Force was no longer experimenting. It was transforming. What began as Armstrong's sketches on a chalkboard and LeMay's geometric diagrams had evolved into a full-scale tactical revolution, unfolding across the airfields of East Anglia as hundreds of B-17 crews learned to fly not as individuals, but as atoms in a vast airborne machine. The Combat Box was no longer theory, it was becoming doctrine, and the Luftwaffe had no idea the sky above Europe was being rebuilt against them. Training consumed every hour of daylight, at Thorpe Abbotts, Ridgewell, Bassingbourn, Great Ashfield, and Snetterton Heath. Entire groups practiced stagger climbs, echelon turns, and three-tiered stacking until gunners could predict the exact shadow cast by the bomber above them. Pilots cursed as they tried to maintain 25 meters of spacing in turbulence thick enough to rattle teeth. Radio operators rehearsed interplane signals, passing formation corrections without breaking discipline. For every crewman, one truth became clear: a combat box was not forgiving. If you drifted high, low, forward, or back, you didn't just endanger your own aircraft, you punched holes in the wall of fire meant to keep everyone alive. But when flown correctly, it was beautiful, terrifying, and mathematically lethal. A standard group formation by mid-1943 consisted of 3 squadrons: the lead squadron in the center, the low squadron offset down and right, and the high squadron offset up and left. Each squadron flew its own internal combat box of 12 B-17s, each bomber staggered both vertically and horizontally so that no field of fire overlapped inefficiently and no blind spot remained uncovered. From a distance, the formation resembled a floating fortress, a three-dimensional lattice of aluminum, guns, exhaust, and contrails weaving together into a single organism. The system's genius lay in multiplication. A lone B-17 carried up to 13 50-caliber machine guns. A 3-squadron combat box could mass more than 450 guns firing in nearly every direction. Long before P-51 Mustangs arrived to escort them deep into Germany, the B-17s were teaching the Luftwaffe a brutal lesson. You don't attack one bomber, you attack all of them. The Germans learned this the hard way on 14 May 1943, when the 91st and 351st Bomb Groups flew one of the earliest polished combat box formations against Kiel. Jagdgeschwaden 1 and 11 pounced on the formation, diving in from high 12 o'clock where B-17s were traditionally vulnerable. Instead of scattering panic, their attack triggered a volcanic eruption of interlocking tracers that forced the fighters to break left and right before reaching firing range. 2 FW-190s overshot into the crossfire of the high element and were shredded in seconds. A Bf-109 tried the vertical climb and roll approach, an advanced Luftwaffe maneuver designed to drop directly into the weak top arc of a bomber, but the high squadron's top turrets tore into him before he completed the roll. Post-mission intelligence reported that German pilots were surprised by the density of fire. That was an understatement. After-action reports from the Luftwaffe described the formations as impregnable from above and front unless attacked in mass. Their problem was simple. The Luftwaffe no longer had enough experienced fighter pilots to mass attacks safely. Losing 2 or 3 fighters for every bomber damaged or destroyed was not sustainable. Colonel Curtis LeMay, now responsible for leading entire combat wings, was relentless in refining the formation. He enforced brutal discipline during training, forcing crews to fly so tightly that co-pilots could read the stencil numbers on the next aircraft's vertical stabilizer. He introduced synchronized turns that allowed the whole combat box to bank as one, maintaining arcs of fire even during evasive maneuvers. He drilled navigators to keep dead on course so the entire formation could hit targets with precision, because if one squadron drifted, the whole structure unraveled. Many crews hated him for it. Later, almost all the pilots admitted LeMay had saved their lives. By June 1943, the combat box was tested again, this time over the Ruhr, the heart of German industry, defended by some of the heaviest flat concentrations in the world. On 22 June, the 3rd Bombardment Wing bombed Huls. The Luftwaffe launched one of its largest coordinated attacks of the year, throwing more than 100 fighters at the inbound formations. But the combat box held. The Luftwaffe tried high frontal attacks. They tried beam attacks from 3 and 9 o'clock. They tried massed vertical approaches. Nothing worked. A later Luftwaffe technical summary stated, "American formations must be broken before close approach is possible. If formation remains intact, losses will be unacceptable." But the formation did remain intact, because that was the entire point. Breaking the box meant breaking discipline, and by mid-1943, the Americans had transformed formation discipline into a religion. Meanwhile, American gunners were becoming deadly marksmen. Waist gunners learned to time the parallax shift of incoming fighters, firing not at the fighter itself, but at where it would be when the next bomber's turret stitched the same arc. Tail gunners learned to fake weakness, letting a fighter believe it had found a blind spot, only to lure it into the kill zone of the high squadron above. The combat box was more than a formation. It was a trap, and German commanders realized it too late. As summer wore on, the 8th Air Force prepared for deeper raids to Regensburg, Schweinfurt, and the heart of Hitler's industrial empire, and the combat box would soon face the ultimate test. Luftwaffe commanders still considered the B-17 a difficult target, but not an impossible one. What they had not yet seen, at least not fully formed, was the wall of fire the Americans were now capable of projecting. A wall that would soon force the Germans to change tactics, reconsider losses, and question whether any fighter, no matter how skilled, could survive diving into a storm of 50 caliber fury unleashed by dozens of B-17s flying as one. The sky was changing, and the Luftwaffe was about to collide with an airborne fortress unlike anything they had ever faced. Dawn on 17 August 1943 rose over East Anglia with a pale, metallic glow, the kind of washed-out light that made the aluminum skins of the B-17s gleam like frost as ground crews rolled them out onto the hardstands. This was no ordinary mission. More than 300 flying fortresses from the 4th and 1st Bombardment Wings were preparing to strike two of the most valuable targets in the Reich, the Regensburg Messerschmitt factories and the Schweinfurt ball-bearing plants. It would be the first double strike deep into Germany. No diversions, no half measures. Success depended entirely on whether the new combat box could survive the Luftwaffe's attempts to tear it apart. Pilots strapped in knowing the truth whispered across every base from Bassingbourn to Thorpe Abbotts. Quote, "If the formation breaks, we die." From the moment the first wave crossed the Dutch coast, the Luftwaffe pounced. Dozens of Bf-109s from Jagdgeschwader 3 and 26, joined by FW-190s from JG-1, clawed into the sky and dove head-on at the lead squadron of the 4th Wing. This was the same deadly frontal attack that had shattered earlier formations in 1942. But today, instead of meeting scattered fire, the Germans slammed straight into a latticework of .5 caliber streams poured from the layered guns of the combat box. Top turrets, chin turrets, cheek guns, and lead squadron tail gunners firing upward into the path of the dive. Luftwaffe pilots expecting a familiar weak arc found themselves chasing firing zones they could no longer outrun. Several fighters broke off smoking before they ever reached cannon range. Others pressed on, only to be raked by converging tracers from the high and low squadrons. A single German pass now meant being shot at by 40 to 60 guns simultaneously. One FW-190 disintegrated under the crossfire. Another spiraled down, trailing pieces of its left wing. From the cockpit of a lead B-17 in the 384th Bomb Group, Lieutenant Robert Cruikshank later described it. Quote, "It looked like the air itself turned white with gunfire." Yet even the combat box had limits. For 2 hours, the formation endured unbroken fighter attacks, high side, low six, beam, vertical dives. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had because it knew the significance of the targets. By the time the Regensburg force reached its IP, initial point, more than 20 B-17s had already fallen. But something had changed in the air. Despite the losses, the German fighters were dying in alarming numbers. After-action intelligence tallied more than 30 fighters likely destroyed and dozens damaged. Fighter Gruppen reported severe pilot casualties. It was becoming brutally clear the combat box did not prevent losses, it multiplied the cost of attacking. Over Regensburg, the formation tightened again, ignoring the holes punched into its structure. Bomb bay doors opened. Bombardiers locked onto the Messerschmitt assembly halls. Precision mattered, discipline mattered. Every ship in the box had to drop simultaneously or drift into catastrophic overlap. At 11:30 hours, Regensburg disappeared under the carpet of 1,000-pound and 500-pound bombs. Fire and smoke boiled upward. The Messerschmitt production line, critical for the Bf-109G, was left a twisted ruin. But the Luftwaffe was waiting on the withdrawal route. The Regensburg group, ordered to continue to North Africa rather than return to England, had no hope of escort, no hope of reinforcement, and no hope of seeing friendly fighters for hours. Their only protection was the combat box. And somehow, battered and bloodied, it held. Meanwhile, the Schweinfurt force, delayed and deprived of the timing that was supposed to split Luftwaffe response, faced the worst of the storm. German fighters launched wave after wave, sometimes attacking with as many as 40 aircraft simultaneously. It was here that the combat box demonstrated its most terrifying strength. It punished every mistake. Any fighter that misjudged closure rate found itself flying directly into the overlapping arcs of the low squadron. Any fighter that tried to linger at 6 o'clock discovered the high squadron's tail guns stitching the sky with deadly precision. Luftwaffe pilots later admitted they had never faced such dense fire. A Jagdgeschwader 26 report complained, quote, "impossible approach without heavy losses," end quote. But the Americans were paying for their victory. The Schweinfurt force lost 36 B-17’s, the Regensburg force lost 24. Crews were shaken, many never made it home. And yet, even in the disaster, the truth was undeniable. Had those same groups flown without the combat box, losses would have exceeded 100 aircraft, probably more. What survived only survived because the formation had turned a scattered group of bombers into a colossal three-dimensional fortress of steel and fire. German commanders studying the aftermath realized this too late. Before Regensburg-Schweinfurt, they believed massed frontal attacks and vertical dives would always break American formations. After August 17, they were forced to confront a new reality. The era of attacking B-17’s as isolated targets was over. To reach the bombers, German pilots now had to fly through a machine designed to kill them. And the worst part for the Luftwaffe was this. The combat box was still improving. Each loss taught a lesson. Each gun jam taught a mechanic where to reroute ammunition belts. Each mid-air scare taught a pilot how to tighten spacing. What survived Regensburg and Schweinfurt would form the backbone of missions in 1944, missions that would devastate German industry once long-range escorts arrived. The Luftwaffe had pushed as hard as it could. The combat box had bled, but it had not broken. And somewhere in the wreckage of Schweinfurt, in the shattered ruins of Regensburg, German commanders began to understand a terrible truth. The Americans had finally found a way to make the B-17 as deadly defensively as it was offensively. The Flying Fortress had become exactly what its name promised. A fortress in formation. A fortress with teeth. A fortress the Luftwaffe could no longer ignore. By early 1944, the combat box was no longer a new tactic. It was a monster the Luftwaffe could neither break nor evade, a flying wall of guns so dense and disciplined that German pilots began referring to it bitterly as Die fliegende Festungsmauer, the flying fortress wall. What had debuted painfully over Bremen and Hamm in 1943 had now matured into a perfectly tuned war machine, just as the Americans prepared to launch the most decisive air offensive of the European War, Operation Argument, better known as Big Week, from 20 to 25 February 1944. The timing was catastrophic for Germany. Luftwaffe fighter strength was already stretched thin by attrition on the Eastern Front. Fuel shortages were growing, and new pilots were being rushed into combat with barely 100 flying hours, less than half the experience needed to survive a single attack run on a B-17 formation. Against this crumbling Air Force, the 8th Air Force unleashed hundreds of B-17s in combat box formations, escorted for the first time all the way to the target by P-51 Mustangs. The Luftwaffe expected to fight bombers. Instead, it found itself fighting an entire air ecosystem built to annihilate it. On 20 February, as 291 B-17s from the 3rd and 1st Bombardment Divisions crossed the Dutch coast, the sky erupted in swirling contrails as Jagdgeschwader 26, 54, and 11 rose to meet them. The Germans assumed escort fighters could be peeled away or overwhelmed as they had been in 1943. But the Mustangs shredded the early attacks, forcing the fighters to break off before they reached the bombers. For the first time in the war, the Luftwaffe was forced to attack the combat box while under attack themselves. Those who reached the B-17s did so at full throttle, exhausted, and already damaged, and this was precisely when the combat box became lethal. A B-17 formation alone could drown an attacking fighter in overlapping .50 cal fire. A combat box with continuous P-51 sweeps above it was something else entirely, a kill zone. German pilots tried massed frontal attacks, the same tactic that had torn open American formations the previous year. But now, with the high squadron offset upward and inward, the nose of every lead aircraft was covered by crossfire from at least 6 B-17s. When a group of FW-190As of JG-11 charged in from 12 o'clock high, they were shredded before reaching cannon range. 2 exploded instantly, and 3 more fell away trailing smoke. The Luftwaffe later reported that direct approach on the lead aircraft is no longer possible. Side attacks fared no better. The low squadron, once the formation's Achilles heel, now carried staggered waist guns and reinforced tail arcs, unleashing a blizzard of fire that made even veteran pilots hesitate. One former Bf-109 pilot recalled after the war, "Flying at the fortress wall was like diving into spinning saw blades." But Big Week was only the beginning. Through March and April 1944, combat box formations repeatedly punched deep into Germany, Berlin, Brunswick, Oschersleben, Gotha, each mission a calculated assault on the heart of German aircraft production. These were not symbolic raids, they were executions. The Americans targeted factories producing Bf-109 airframes, FW-190 engines, and the essential ball bearings that kept the German war industry alive. Every time the Luftwaffe rose to intercept, the same brutal equation played out. Attack the formation, lose pilots. Break off, lose factories. They could not afford either. And so, they bled. On 8 March 1944, during a raid on Berlin, a formation of 150 B-17s from the 1st Bombardment Division flew a combat box so tight that Luftwaffe reports later described it as unbroken despite heavy attacks. German pilots attempted coordinated high side assaults, diving through cloud breaks to strike the formation's flanks. But as they swept in from 2 o'clock high, they exposed themselves to the fire of the high squadron and Mustang escort, slashing down from above. Within seconds, 5 German fighters were downed. The survivors described the formation as impenetrable. That word, once unthinkable, began appearing regularly in German intelligence summaries. Meanwhile, the Americans were refining the combat box even further. Gunners synchronized their firing to avoid overheating barrels. Pilots practiced combat turns, tight, coordinated banks where the entire formation pivoted as a unit, denying German fighters predictable firing lines. Bombardiers drilled on the new synchronous release system that ensured every bomb in a squadron fell within seconds of each other, maximizing accuracy. Every improvement widened the gap between what the Luftwaffe expected and what it actually faced. By the time the 8th Air Force returned to Schweinfurt in March 1944, the Luftwaffe was already a shadow of its former self. Fresh replacements, many barely trained, were thrown into attacks that killed them within minutes. Veteran pilots, those who had survived Spain, France, the USSR, and the peak of 1943, now found themselves facing combat boxes that looked nothing like the loose American formations they once dominated. The B-17s were no longer prey. They were a moving fortress system, protected above, below, ahead, behind, and between by a living mesh of fire. A returning B-17 gunner from the 303rd Bomb Group summarized it best. "We didn't just shoot back, we shot everywhere." By mid-1944, the Luftwaffe reached a breaking point. German fighter groups reported pilot losses exceeding replacement rates by nearly 300%. Aircraft production still rose briefly, but without trained pilots, the new Bf-109Gs and FW-190As were flown by boys with 20 hours of cockpit time. Against Mustangs above and the combat box ahead, they died in minutes. German bomber interception doctrine, the system that once terrorized Europe, collapsed. The combat box was not merely a formation, it was a turning point in the air war. It ensured the Americans could keep bombing. It ensured Germany could not replace its losses. It showed the world a truth German commanders were now forced to admit in their own reports. The American bomber formations have become nearly untouchable. And the most devastating missions were still to come. By late 1944, the combat box was no longer just a formation.
It was a weaponized idea, one that had reshaped the air war so completely that German commanders now viewed daylight bomber interception as a near-suicidal proposition. The Luftwaffe still rose to fight, but not with the confidence it once had. Now, every pilot who climbed into a Bf-109G or FW-190A knew he would be flying into a storm of gunfire dense enough to tear an aircraft apart in seconds. And every American bomber crewman who climbed into a B-17 knew something just as important. The combat box had given them a chance to come home. That chance became reality during the final year of the war. In the autumn of 1944, as Allied ground forces fought through the Hurtgen forest and toward the Siegfried Line, B-17s pounded German industrial complexes with ruthless regularity. Marienfelde, Merseburg, Ludwigshafen, Cologne, synthetic fuel installations at Luna and Zeitz. Now escorted the entire way by P-51s, P-47s, and the long-legged P-38J, the bombers flew in combat boxes so refined, so tight, so synchronized that German flak officers compared them to steel cubes drifting across the sky. They were no longer merely defensive, they were offensive systems built on mutual protection. One mission in particular demonstrated the full maturity of the combat box, the attack on Merseburg Luna on 2 November 1944, one of the most heavily defended targets in the Reich. The Luftwaffe scrambled everything it had left: JG-300, JG-302, JG-4, units filled with veterans, novices, and last-ditch Sturmgruppen flying heavily armored FW-190s intended to ram bomber formations if necessary. Storm after storm of fighters hurled themselves into the combat box. They were met not by chaos, but by discipline. B-17 gunners called out bearings and ranges with the precision of surgeons. Fighters 10 o'clock high, 800 yards, 6 o'clock level, break left element. The formation adjusted minutely, shifting arcs so that no blind spot opened. When a pack of FW-190s attempted a coordinated attack at 1 o'clock level, they flew straight into a crossfire from the high squadron's top turrets and the lead squadron's chin guns. 4 fell within seconds. A Luftwaffe pilot who survived described it later. It was not like attacking bombers, it was like attacking a fortress city in the air. Even as Germany's ability to launch fighters collapsed, the combat box retained its value. The threat now was flak, fields of black bursts that shredded aluminum, severed control cables, and blew gashes in the wings of returning fortresses. But the formation minimized risk even here. By keeping altitude, spacing, and geometry precise, it ensured that if one plane drifted, the next would not plow into it during evasive maneuvers. When a fortress was crippled, the box shifted instinctively, closing its ranks around the gap. Survival was not luck, it was engineering, of men, not just machines. As 1945 dawned, the Luftwaffe was a ghost. Fuel shortages grounded entire Jagdgeschwader. Veteran pilots were dead. Replacement pilots, barely trained boys, often refused to attack the combat box at all. A German after-action report from January stated bluntly, "Fighter attacks on American heavy bomber formations are no longer practical." With air opposition crumbling, the B-17s turned their attention relentlessly to infrastructure targets: marshalling yards, bridges, oil depots, rail hubs, U-boat pens, synthetic plants. The combat box was still flown, not out of necessity, but because it represented the perfected doctrine of U.S. strategic bombing. Even with minimal fighter threat, the box kept navigation tight, improved bombing accuracy, and ensured no bombers strayed into unexpected flak concentrations. The last great demonstration came in February 1945, when more than 1,100 B-17s and B-24s struck Berlin and central Germany. A Luftwaffe observer captured that month described the sight. Row upon row of silver boxes, each protecting the other, layered above and below. There is no way in. We no longer fight them, we only watch them pass. That statement was more than defeat, it was acknowledgement. The Germans had underestimated American adaptability. They had expected disorganized raids, loose formations, and unprotected bombers. Instead, they faced a synchronized death machine built on mathematics, discipline, and the stubborn will of crews who refused to fly alone. When the war finally ended in May 1945, American generals reviewing the air campaign drew a clear conclusion. The combat box had been as decisive as radar, as bomb sights, as long-range fighters. Without it, daylight bombing would have been impossible. Without daylight bombing, Germany's aircraft industry would have recovered. And without the collapse of the Luftwaffe, the ground war from Normandy to the Rhine would have been far bloodier. The combat box lived on after the war, not in the same form, but in its philosophy. The U.S. Air Force's post-war doctrine of mutual support, layered formations, overlapping engagement zones, and synchronized precision all trace their roots to those tense mornings over England when young men crawled into cold aluminum shells and trusted that the plane beside them would not drift. That trust saved thousands of lives. Today, when historians speak of the flying fortress, they rarely mean the aircraft alone. They mean the system, the unity of dozens of bombers acting as one. They mean the combat box, the invention that let the B-17 fulfill its name, not individually, but collectively. A fortress is not a building. It is a wall, a shield, a structure of many stones locked tightly so none can fall. In 1943, the Germans believed they were fighting bombers. By 1944, they understood the truth. They were fighting a formation. And in the end, it was the formation, not any single aircraft, that proved untouchable.